Benson.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and I echo everything that the sentiments that Eric has said about the meeting and the goals and the focus of the meeting. So as I was putting, Eric had asked me to give this talk on my experience with accumulating 10,000 hours of experience, and I came across this this study about how people retain things from an educational standpoint. And I was pleased to hear that 75% of retention comes from practice and 90% by teaching. I was very disappointed that lectures you only retain 5% of the material. So we'll see how this goes. So 10,000 hours. Well, that comes from a book called Outliers from Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm was born in England but grew up in Elmira, Ontario, and he came up with this concept of becoming, I guess, an expert, if you will, by accumulating 10,000 hours of practice. And in his book, he comes up with a variety of different reasons why this 10,000 hours works out, particularly a concept with the Beatles when they were playing in Hamburg. It was many years of working together, 10,000 hours. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to try and discuss, if I can, some tips, perhaps, of what I've learned and what has turned out to be a little bit more than 30,000 hours. So I won't go into how many years that actually breaks down to. So what kind of tips does an interventional cardiologist need to be successful? I mean, is it crisis prevention? Is it tips for billing, even in Canada, tips for buying insurance, how to stay sane when you're on call, tips for good behavior, teamwork, how to use the equipment, how to do techniques, a whole variety of things. And I wasn't quite sure what to do. So I went to the internet, as everybody does for everything, and got 80,000 possible lists of tips. So this is sort of like a group of tips that I sort of picked out, listings of tips, and perhaps you get tips for getting ready to be interviewed, or tips for public speaking, or in my case, perhaps tips for a more effective PowerPoint presentation. I'm not quite sure where this is going to lead. So this, in the next couple minutes, is going to be my list of 10 things that I think might be helpful. I think it's important to take advantage of the experience of people who have done things before. So when you're closing that ASD or positioning that stent or managing a disaster, learn from the mistakes of others, because you're not going to live long enough to make them all yourself. And I can assure you that that's something that John and Zaid would support as they think about the things that they've done over the years. Avoid the traps of procedures, because in the cath lab, as in forest fires, big problems always start out small. And the little things that might go wrong sometimes end up to be major disasters. And I think all the adults and many of the pediatric cardiologists in here understand that at the very beginning of a procedure, if your stick is too high or too low, you're going to be in trouble as the procedure goes on. And I remember cases where the fellow had punctured the artery above the inferior epigastric, and that was the end of the procedure. The day it was done, it was all done. So you have to be careful about how you start things. And this is the one thing I always tell my fellows on a recurring basis. It's much easier to stay out of trouble than get out of trouble. And that requires planning and thoughtfulness about what the conduct of the procedure, and importantly, why that procedure is being done. So in late June 1876, George Custer was informed that there were some Indians gathered around the Little Bighorn, so he decided, without analyzing the facts, to ride out with 250 men to surround the Indians. And that was a serious mistake.
Just don't tap, because the sound on the video gets screwed up. Keep the microphone in. Just don't tap on it. Sorry.
Respect your coworkers.
Please, please, please. Please, please.
I don't have to say much more about that. So, Eric had given a talk like this before, and about giving a good service for your patients and your colleagues. And I call this the Horlick's 3 A's of being available, affable, and able. And what does that mean? Being available. Don't be missing in action. You got to be able to people have to be able to get in touch with you. Don't be slow to respond to help to give advice. I won't touch that anymore. And I have to say, over the last number of years, sometimes I go into the catheter laboratory, and I'm not quite sure that, gee, I really want to do that case. And you know, that it was a surgical conference, and the surgeons and the referring doctors said we want to have a study. You know, I don't want to do it. It's not the right thing to do. Sometimes, in order to be collegial, you have to sometimes hold your nose and go ahead and do the case. You have to be affable. You have to know your referring doctors. Getting to know you is very important. For those of you who are old enough to know what that is, that's from The King and I. Call the doctor with the results, and let the referring doctor know what the plan is, and avoid criticizing their plan, which sometimes, you know, you start talking, you say, yeah, are you sure you want to do that coarctation stent on this patient? That's not the right thing to do. Our business is a team sport, and you know, it's not just the procedure we do in the laboratory. It involves a whole host of individuals, just some of which are listed here, and it's important to understand and how to work with your colleagues. Don't overestimate your skills. At the end of a fellowship at SickKids, I sit down with the fellows and I say, you know, you're trained, you could do a lot of things, but start out with PDAs and pulmonary valves. Do those well, develop a reputation, and then start to push the envelope. Don't be too much of a cowboy. It's good to be a little bit overcautious. Ask people for help. It goes well within your own community, within your hospital, to have people come in. Everybody feels good about helping. And that's particularly important with tough cases. And of course, it goes without saying that no matter what we do, it's very important to have a long discussion with the families about what the bad things could happen during the procedure. Don't forget to do that. The first time you meet the family is not when you want to tell them the patient's had a stroke. You want to talk to them before any intervention. And don't be a flibbertigibbet. I won't tell you what that means. You can look it up, but it is a word. Measure twice and cut once. I think everybody can agree to that. Make the measurements. Don't put the wrong size stent in. You'll be putting 2 stents in. We've all been there, that the stent's not been long enough. I remember when I talked about right ventricular outflow tract stenting in our beginning experience, we would put the stent across the pulmonary valve and in the infundibulum, and the patients would come back 3 weeks later with stenosis at the os because we didn't extend the stent long enough. So it's important to make sure you understand the anatomy and that you choose the right equipment to accomplish the procedure. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That mistakes happen. It's not the worst thing in the world. If you're trying to do something that you think is indicated and appropriate, and prepare for the case. I'm sure I'm talking to the converted about people going through training. They understand this, but it surprises me as we talk to people in other venues on blogs and the like, that sometimes they don't understand what the process is. So understand what the reason for the study is. Know the anatomy, the surgical history, know the medical problems that the patient has, and of course, informed consent, and ask questions. And don't forget that the focus is on the child, or the adult, if it will, and not just a procedure. It's not just a technical event. It's trying to help the patient in a difficult situation. And this is very important. This is something that you cut out for yourself as well. And that's that. And this is a saying that people I've heard many times, that you only get one chance to make a first impression, and it takes 1,000 cases to make a good reputation, and only one to ruin one. And you have to be very careful about your process in the procedures themselves. And I've heard it said that the difference between a good and great interventionist is courage. But I think, and I've heard Eric say this, you have to know the difference between courage and stupidity. So with that, I want to say good luck. This is a great profession that we've all chosen, and we should all be proud to be part of what I believe is one of the greatest miracles of modern medicine, and that's the management of patients with complex, in our case, congenital heart disease. I remember that, I don't remember personally, but in the 1940s and 50s, our patients were dying before they were a year old. And now there are more adults with congenital heart disease than there are children. And that has to do a lot with what people in this room, what you in this room do to manage patients. So keep calm and practice that 10,000 hours. Thanks very much.